Hey everyone, Mark here. Today I'm going to be looking at 3 more landing mistakes that you can make in Microsoft Flight Simulator. This video is a follow-up on the previous video that I made that looked at other common landing mistakes such as watching the instruments too closely, getting your airspeed wrong, and getting your altitude wrong. Mastering landings though is one of the most important skills in the game, especially when the weather conditions start to become more challenging, so I decided to make another video on the topic. In this video, I'm going to be looking at how to avoid undershooting and overshooting the turn to final, how to avoid having an unstable approach, and how to avoid problems when you're getting close to the ground and you're getting ready to flare. You'll get the most value out of this video if you have some experience landing airplanes in Flight Sim, but you still have a few areas where you could perfect your landing technique to be able to get what's often called in the community a butter landing. Let's jump straight into the first mistake. The first mistake I commonly mistake when I'm flying in a traffic pattern is either undershooting or overshooting the turn from base to final. There are a few different reasons this can happen, but one of the most common problems that I often have is I often forget to plan for the direction of the wind. Even a slight crosswind that's blowing across the runway can affect how soon you have to start your turn in order to end up close to the runway centerline. Once you turn onto base, if the wind is going to be coming at you, so you're going to have a headwind, you're going to want to start the turn to final a lot later than you normally would, since it's going to take less space to turn that last 90 degrees, because your speed over the ground is going to be a lot slower because of the headwind. On the other hand, if you've got a tailwind, you're going to want to start that turn a lot sooner than you normally would, or you're going to end up overshooting the runway centerline very easily. If wind isn't a factor, where you're going to start your turn from base to final is going to be slightly different based on every airplane, but generally speaking, you're going to want to make sure that you're using either a shallow or a medium bank turn. You want to avoid having to do a steep turn at all costs. That's because the airspeed at which the wings are going to stall is going to be much higher with a steep turn. And since you're already flying slowly getting ready to land, you're already close to that stall speed. It could put you in a really precarious position where your airspeed drops too close to the stall speed and you end up dropping out of the sky. What I do when I'm checking out a new airplane is I'm going to take it up in ideal weather conditions first, so very little wind, so that I can get an idea of what a normal landing feels like in that airplane. Like I was saying, every plane is slightly different, so it really does take some time to learn when and where you need to start your base to final turn. Alright, so let's say I've done my very best while coming in on my base to final turn, and I've still ended up in a situation where I've overshot the runway. What I'll do in that case is I'm going to hold the turn that I'm already in, but I won't increase the bank angle for the reason I was just mentioning. I want to make sure to stay well away from my airplane stall speed. Once I'm just about back on the center line, that's where I'm going to level the wings. I'm going to give it a couple of seconds to stabilize, and then I'll probably have to do a very slight turn to the right to align myself with the runway center line. I'm continuing to descend at the same time, and if I can't establish myself on the runway center line by the time I reach about 500 feet, that's where I'm going to start thinking about going around to give this landing another try. It's important to be flying the right airspeed on base and on final to make sure you have enough time to correct for any mistakes you make on that last turn. Again, each airplane is going to be different at what airspeed it wants to fly those legs on, but there are a few recommendations from the FAA that you can find in their documentation that you can use if you can't find what the ideal airspeeds are for the airplane that you're flying. The base leg should be flown at 1.4 times the airplane's stall speed in the landing configuration. For example, in the Cessna 208 that I'm flying right now, the landing stall speed is 54 knots, which means I should be flying base at around 75 knots. Once I turn onto final, that's where I need to slow down to 1.3 times the airplane's landing stall speed configuration. That's going to give me plenty of time for any adjustments that I need to make to get on the center line of the runway. If you're not familiar with what your airplane's landing stall speed is, you can approximate it by looking at the airspeed indicator and looking at where the red part of the airspeed indicator meets the white part. The points where those two arcs meet is close enough to be used for your stall speed, and you can do all your calculations based on the airspeed that's there. I find it a little bit harder to correct for an undershoot situation. What I'm going to do as I'm starting to turn to final is I'm going to keep an eye on where the runway is relative to the airplane, and I'm going to adjust early on rather than wait until I've completed most of the turn and I have clearly undershot the runway and it becomes a lot harder to correct. I keep an eye on where it is at all times right at the start, and like that, it gives me a much better chance of lining up with the runway center line. I do that by using the camera focus button, which is going to toggle onto the closest point of interest, which is usually the runway. So that makes it really easy. I just press the button, I can see where the runway is, I can adjust my turn if necessary, and then I can let it go and be back at center looking at my instrument panel. This leads us into the next mistake, which has to do with flying unstable approaches and glide slopes down to the runway. I got a comment in the previous video that I made on landing mistakes from a person called Night Owl, who requested that I talk a little bit more about glide slopes and attitude, and that's what I'm going to talk about in part in this next mistake. One thing you're going to hear a lot of when you're looking to improve your landings is to get better at something called a stabilized approach. And there are a few different criteria that are used to determine if your approach is stable enough for landing. First, you want to make sure that you have a clear path to the runway and that you're lined up with the runway center line. I just looked at that a few minutes ago in the first mistake in this video, so I won't spend too much time on it here, but all of the advice that I gave there applies here as well. Next, you want to make sure that your plane is configured properly in the landing configuration. That means you need to make sure that your airspeed is right, that your power is set properly, and that your flaps and landing gear are set as well. Finally, and probably most importantly, you want to have a descent rate that's going to be fairly stable. We've all been in a situation at one point or another where we realize we're coming in too high, we chop the power, we drop the nose, and we try and recapture the glide path to avoid having to go around. But this really isn't the best way to get down on the ground. The problem is that you won't be able to configure the airplane properly for final approach, and you won't have enough time to stabilize the airplane once you've re-intercepted the glide path. You can get away with this from time to time, but it generally leads to a pretty bad landing. That's why you want to plan the approach a little bit better, and I'm going to look at a way to do that right now. There's a commonly referenced way to fly a stable approach all the way down to the ground, and it's something called the 3-to-1 principle. The principle can be summed up to say that for every 3 nautical miles that you fly over the ground, you should be descending about 1,000 feet in altitude. That's going to give you a 3-degree glide slope, which is the most commonly used descent ratios for runways around the world. Some runways do have steeper descent ratios, but I'll ignore those for the purposes of this video. With the 3-to-1 ratio in mind, an easy way to make sure you've set yourself up to have plenty of space to have a stabilized approach is to make sure that you turn onto final when you're about 3 nautical miles from the airport and you have at least 1,000 feet of altitude. If you're flying in a traffic pattern and you don't want to fly 3 nautical miles past the end of the runway while you're on the downwind leg, what you can do is you can halve it. In that case, you might have only a 1.5 nautical mile final, which means you'd want to be at around 500 feet once you do turn onto your final approach. Since you're going to be about 1.5 nautical miles, that's still going to respect the 3-to-1 ratio. This almost goes without saying, but the further away you are from the runway when you set up your 3-to-1 ratio, the higher the probability that you're going to have a stable approach all the way down to the ground. Before I move on to the final landing mistake that I want to cover in this video, I do want to remind you, if you got some value from this video, please make sure to hit that like button. And if you're one of the almost 70% of people who aren't subscribed to the channel and are watching this video, please consider doing so. Not only will you get notified when the latest video comes out, but it'll also help others find the channel and help others improve their skills in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Finally, let's look at the last of the landing problems that I often have to deal with myself, and that's problems with the flare, such as floating or ballooning. I find the flare, which is what you do just before you're about to touch down on the ground, to be one of the hardest parts to get right in a landing. It's hard to tell how far off the ground you are in the sim because there isn't much peripheral vision unless you've got an ultra-wide screen. And unlike with airliners, you don't get a call out when you're 10 feet above, which is the signal for you to start your flare. For the general aviation aircraft that you're probably flying in Flight Sim, that's probably the ideal to start the flare somewhere at around 10 feet off the ground. But you can't do that reliably even with a digital altimeter. As you're coming into land, you're supposed to shift your focus towards the other end of the runway. But if you do that too soon as you cross over the threshold, what's going to happen is you're going to be more likely to start your flare a little bit high, since it's going to feel like you're actually lower than you actually think you are. The trick I've learned to use is to watch for when the ground starts taking up more space in the sides of the screen and it starts coming a little bit higher and higher. At that point, you're getting pretty close to the ground, so that's where you can focus more on the end of the runway and start your flare to make sure that your main gear touch down first. If you've gotten yourself into a situation where you flared too high above the runway, there are still some things you can do to recover. One thing you want to avoid is adding any additional back pressure on the stick. You want to try and hold that exact same pitch attitude until the airplane slows down enough to start descending. As the airplane starts descending, the airspeed is also going to be descending, and that's when you can try and do a second flare, which will hopefully get you down on the ground with your main gear first. This all happens really quickly when you're flying though, so you have to have the procedure memorized to do it properly. Another thing you want to avoid when you're in a high flare is avoid pushing the nose down again. That could cause the nose wheel to come into contact with the ground first if you misjudged how high and how much altitude you still have. And that's definitely going to be a recipe for a bad landing and possibly even damaging the airplane inside of the sim. Lastly, keep an eye on your airspeed as you're going past the runway threshold. Final approach speed isn't the airspeed that you want to be flying just before you start your flare. That's probably going to still be a few knots too fast for you to be able to settle down on the ground safely. Once I've gone past the runway threshold, that's where I'm going to start pulling the throttle back, and I'm going to try and get my airspeed as close to my stall speed without actually stalling the airplane above the ground. If you get this part of the landing right, your odds of getting that perfect butter landing that you're looking for are going to go up significantly. And like I've said a few times now in the video, all of this happens really quickly when you're coming in for landing, so it's something that you want to practice over and over and over. There are a bunch of different ways that you can practice landings in Flight Sim. I've actually made a video that covers 4 different ways to do that, and I'll add a link to it in the video for you to check that out if you want. And with that, I'm going to wrap up the video here. I hope you learned something useful to improve your future landings in Microsoft Flight Simulator. And if you did, please make sure to hit that like button. And if you have any questions or comments, or you want to add on to something that I said, feel free to add a comment below. I'll see you in the next video.